A couple of years ago, Case IH did this national survey of farmers asking them, well, what new practice are you going to implement on your farm? And the overwhelming number one choice was cover crops. Well, cover crops aren't exactly new. It's been there for centuries, but it just seems like the adoption is growing very quickly in the United States.
Well, we get so focused on trying to make our land profitable for us. So what crop can I raise that will take advantage of the full growing season and deliver me the most money back? And when we think about a cover crop, it just is a whole different process of thinking, because now we're looking at what can I do to protect my soil for whatever period of time there isn't a crop growing
and
in my
help
field.
me get a better yield, not only next year, but for many years down the road. If, for example, you build the organic matter in your soil, you're going to reap long-term benefits out of that, 20, 30, 50 years out of that. So, I mean, it's just a big picture way of thinking of things. But yes, I mean, even protecting the soil, that does become a big issue. We as farmers don't want erosion, so you might pick a cover crop that's going to help you there. Another thing we've done on our farm is picked either turnips or radishes to try to break through compaction. That's important. You might also pick a legume crop. We just have used old soybeans, soybeans we weren't able to plant, or leftover soybeans we had, and thrown those out there, helping to add more nitrogen to the soil. There are so many different potential benefits from cover crops. We do think it's important that every farmer takes a look at this.
Well, the other thing is, what kind of cover crop are you going to plant? And you mentioned, well, you might put a legume out there, or you might put a grass out there. I mean, there's
a
number of different
blends.
It's a number of different species that you could be using. So most farmers that are doing cover crops are using some sort of a blend. And you know, a lot of times when farmers will get started with cover crops, they'll say, well, I don't know exactly which one or two to use. Picking a blend kind of helps you out too, because now you can look at a variety of different plants out in your field and say, hey, you know what? Those radishes really looked pretty good out there for me, or they did X, Y, and Z for my soil, or the turnips did this or that, or putting grass out there really held my soil in place. I mean, you just have to work with an agronomist a little bit and say, all right, what different benefits do I need in my ground? Maybe it's, I've been too wet this year. I need something that's going to be a high user of water to try and dry that soil out a little bit. Or it could be the opposite. You're in a dry part of the country. See a lot of cover crops going into arid climates, and guys say, I want to preserve the moisture in my field.
Well, this list of benefits we talk about with cover crops, you can find that on agphd.com under the resources tab. I do think it's important that you consider all the different potential benefits, but one of the most important things we want you to look at is if you weren't able to plant a crop, let's say in a prevent plant situation, or there are a lot of guys that do this wheat fallow type rotation. We don't like to see that. The reason why is because what happens in a fallow situation, even if it's only fallow for a couple, 3 months, you're going to have fewer beneficial microbes left alive in that soil. They need something to feed on. They need a crop, a plant to feed on. So mycorrhiza fungi, for example, and I know when we start talking about some of these things, you say, well, I don't really know about that. It's hard for me to understand that. Don't get me wrong, we farm too. It's real easy when I go out, I'm going to kill a weed. Hey, it's dead. I see, yeah, that was great. Okay, but how about tiny little microbes? Fungi and bacteria in the soil. You don't see that. You don't exactly know what's going on, but just understand when you read about these things and all the research that has been done, things like mycorrhiza fungi are unbelievably important in helping nutrients get into plants. Without those beneficial fungi and bacteria, you're going to have far fewer nutrients getting into the plant, even with the same number of total nutrients in the soil. So you want to have those things alive and growing into the next season. That's why they talk about fallow syndrome all the time. What fallow syndrome is basically is dead mycorrhiza fungi, the mycorrhiza fungi that didn't survive. They can't help your next crop. So your next crop, even though there's phosphorus in the soil, it doesn't get into the plant. So your plant turns purple. We don't want fallow syndrome. We don't want you to have those issues. Put a cover crop out there, and at least your next crop is going to be better than if you left that as true fallow.
Well, the big thing is, you know, there are lots of benefits with cover crops. It just takes a little bit of time to get the full effect of what those cover crops can do. Now, that's not saying that if you only had a couple of weeks and you got grass up and growing, hey, you did protect yourself for a short period of time. But to get the maximum growth, most of the cover crops you're going to plant will need 60 days to get fully established and get deep roots.
Yeah, and so like in our area where we have corn and soybeans coming off late in the fall and then it's going to freeze up, it's not going to work very well. But
well, not to wait until after you harvest, but what many guys are doing is trying to experiment with putting aerial seeding, or even using ground rigs to run through and seed in between the rows of crop, you know, early, right about the time in soybeans, for example, when you start seeing some leaves start to turn yellow, here's your shot. Get out
but
there.
That's fine, Darren, in a year where we're going to have early harvest and when we have a warm summer. In 2012, for example, and just about everything was off in September, yeah, we've got a couple of months after that, after harvest. But most years, we don't have a couple of months after harvest. It's not going to do you a lot of good. But there are tremendous amounts of acres of small grain, or areas in our country where we do harvest corn and soybeans early enough that a cover crop would be beneficial.
Well, there's certainly a lot of reasons you may consider using a cover crop on your farm. For me, the big thing is just keeping something growing in your field as much of the year as you possibly can. That really helps the microbes in your soil, and that's going to impact your crop for years to come. The other thing is just protecting your soil, holding it in place, stopping erosion, whether it's from wind or rain. Cover crops can serve many purposes on your farm.
Well, one of the purposes that cover crops can serve is keeping weeds down, like our Weed of the Week. Can you identify this week's weed?